Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Today, I'm very glad to be joined on the podcast by Patrick Donadio, who is a nationally recognized communication expert, speaker, educator, and coach, and the author of a great book on communication titled Communicating with Impact. Patrick works with high-level leaders who want to develop professionally and helps their organizations that want to grow people. He's trained thousands of individuals from Fortune 100 companies to organizations, associations, universities, hospitals, and government entities. Welcome to the program, Patrick.
Hello, Charles. Good to be here.
So today I'd love for us to focus on one of my favorite topics, and obviously an area of your expertise is that communicating with impact. And you have a wonderful model that we're going to unpack for our listeners today. But before we do so, love to hear about your background and what got you really interested in this topic.
Well, Charles, I have an undergrad degree in radio and television, and of course went on to get my MBA. And when I was reading at university, I noticed so much how important being a good communicator is. And when I got out and started my business at a very young age, I was about 28, I found that the topic that I seemed to get requested most often was communication skills. So I used to teach communication skills in the first 5 or 7 years. And then I realized what was missing was there wasn't really a process, right? Because people like processes. So I began to think about, from my experience with my coaching, what would be some of the key components that make for great communications? And that's kind of how I came up with the 6 steps of the impact process.
Wonderful. Great to hear. One of the stats that you put, and I love to see if it's still accurate, I assume it is, that we spend 80% of our waking hours in some form of communication. Do you still think that holds true, or perhaps even more today?
I still think it does. And again, when I say some form of communications, there's all kind of forms, right? There's what we call the verbal, the nonverbal, and of course the words and voice of what we have to use. So when you think about it, unless you're sleeping, you're communicating.
That's true. And I'm sure throughout the pandemic, there's been some issues with that communication, right? Because it's taken more of a virtual form. What are some of the things that you've noticed in the last few years that really make being an effective communicator more difficult?
Well, obviously, as you know, we've been doing a lot of virtual work. Luckily, we're back in person, but we're still doing virtual. So I think the number one thing that has really shifted has been the whole idea of not being in a face-to-face kind of communication mode. And a lot of folks really haven't had to use video, haven't had to use this new medium that isn't really new, but, became new to so many folks. And when you think about using virtual or Zoom or, all the kind of programs that are out there, it has a lot more to do with what you're saying in terms of visually and also non-verbally, and not just about your presence.
So go through for us a little bit of those differences. How much does just the best practices of being an effective communicator translate across all mediums? And then what are some of the best practices that you've noticed now that are different in the virtual space?
Well, I would say the first thing I've noticed is it takes a little bit more time to be a better communicator, because it's not like you just walk down the hall, right, and say hello. I mean, now you've got to think about, okay, I'm going to be on a virtual call. So what am I really trying to do? Should I have visuals? Shouldn't I have visuals? How do I engage the group? Right. It's just, I think when people said, oh, it's so much easier now, I don't have to leave the office. I'm like, well, I think it's a little bit harder.
No, you're right. I mean, there's those challenges where you just have to be more deliberate and look for opportunities to have that communication, because you don't have those opportunities where you're running into someone at the office and can have those impromptu talks, conversations, dialogues. So you're definitely right in that regard. But there are certain best practices that I'm sure hold true regardless. Active listening skills, the messaging, the content, those things really translate regardless of the medium you're communicating through, correct?
Oh, yeah. And, when you think about the impact process, the first step is really the one that I think so many people had to spend more time on is, what's my intention? The I is for the intention, and every communication starts as a thought. And that thought needs to be very clear, conscious, and also deliberate. And so when you're working virtually, for example, what's my purpose for this meeting? I think more and more folks are really tired of just getting together for the sake of getting together. And early on in the pandemic, we had so many meetings just to make sure we help people stay connected. But now I think if it's not important, don't waste people's time. So that intention step to me is probably the most critical thing. And that's the step I see most people skip. is it's a very simple step, takes about 30 seconds, Charles, right? What's my intention for this communication? And before you start talking, take 30 seconds and think.
That's so important. And that is the first step of this impact model. It's an acronym, IMPACT. I stands for intention. Intentional communication is more important now than ever. Like you state in your book, if people understand the why, they're more likely to accept the how. Why are you communicating? Intent before content. Put it into a category, identify what that is. And I love the tool that you give and help people out and is the laser focused intention, which you kind of mentioned, but if you could unpack a little bit more just to give our listeners this tool so they can use right away.
Yes, the obvious easy way is to just ask yourself, why am I communicating? And then also, if it's important, communicate the why. But I created this process that's called the laser focused intention. And it really has you take a look at some of the key components right at the beginning. So, for example, I'm going to talk about what? What's the topic? What's the main intention or topic for the communication? To whom? Who's the audience, right? Because if you're talking to leaders or you're talking to frontline staff, it's a different approach. And then, of course, you want to ask the question, what do I want them to do, right? How do I want them to respond, reply? What do I want them to think, do, or feel? And then, of course, the final is there some kind of time frame or deadline? So if you think it through and you really kind of take some of the key parts of this impact process and take 60 seconds and ask yourself those questions, you really end up with almost like a sentence that says, boom, this is exactly what I should be doing. And then you can jump in and get started.
Well, that's what I love about this model, that it provides you a template to use to be a more effective communicator, because a lot of leaders want to be. There's a lot of people purporting, here's a communication class, but they don't give you the steps needed in a very structured format. And that's what your process really does very well. Even like with the 30-second rule for this first step, if you only had 30 seconds to communicate, what would you say? Because all communication, I would argue, could be more succinct.
I agree. And I'm really trying to tell people, look, it's not about working harder. It's about working smarter. You don't need to take a lot more time. You just need to take really focused time. And that intention, laser focused intention statement literally takes like a minute, but it's so focused, it helps you get jump started. And literally in less time, you could be more effective.
And like you stated, it's the most often skipped step because people want to get to the next step of this model, the M, the message. But unless you set the right intention, your message may not be received the way you want or at all.
And like we said, intent before content.
There you go.
People want to jump into content, right? We're all busy. So you want to just pick up the phone or want to start typing and you say, hey, take a break, take a breath, ask yourself the important question. Why am I having this communication? Then you can jump in. And when you think about the M step, Charles, there's two parts really. There's the message and the method. And I want to make sure people remember that you don't want to just use the method you like, right? We all tend to go to the method we like. I love phone calls, boom, I'll just pick up the phone. Or I love emails, or I love texting. And you find out that the receiver doesn't like that particular method, and they don't respond as most often. I'm curious, if you had to pick a method, Charles, what would you say is the method you prefer most often?
I like telephone. I mean, maybe I'm old fashioned, but if I could do face to face, I would do face to face.
Right.
It's harder in a virtual world. So I am the next closest form of communication where I can really have a discussion and hear inflection, tone, voice changes, even hopefully observe body language, right? If I'm on a Zoom, that's what I want to do. I want to try to get as much information about how I'm communicating and being received by that person as I possibly can. So whatever method offers me that kind of feedback is the one I generally will prefer.
Yeah. Well, I'm with you. I'm very similar to you. I'm an extrovert, and I'm old school and I love that having all the components. But unfortunately, a lot of the younger generation, they're not into that. I've got some I got some young adults who work now in the real world. And I remember when they went to college, I tried to call them. And first of all, sometimes the voicemail box was full and they wouldn't even be able to take the message. And then sometimes, they would never get back to me. So I realized, hey, listen, I got to bite the bullet. They like texting. I had to text. I don't like texting, but that's the best communication tool for them. So if you're listening right now, I want to tell you one of the things I encourage you to do is to do a communications audit. Think about what components do your members like to use most often, and when possible, start with their preferred method. Now, every method has an important intention, right? If you've got something very complex, the text is not going to work or an email is not going to work. but you might start with that method because that's the one you know they're going to respond to. You might text and say, hey, listen, I really need to talk with you. When's a good time for us to have a call today? And then you can get to the more important method. But I think knowing your receiver's preference is a very important part of the process.
I'd agree with you more. So that's an important step for everyone to take so that you're not just defaulting to your own preferred way of communicating. And with the messaging part, we can talk about it verbally. We can talk about it in written communication, which is equally important because I see so often that the written communication suffers in the repertoire of many leaders. They're writing emails that are not read. They're sending out marketing campaigns that are not effective. And I love the structured approach that you give that could be used when you're communicating with someone verbally or through the written word. And that opening is really getting their attention. What are you going to do to pique their curiosity? Maybe that's the subject line in the preview text on an email, or
Right.
maybe it's just starting out your conversation with a story that's impactful that will really cue them in to say, wow, that was impactful. That's something I want to know. Tell me more.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Charles. The opening is critical. And again, depending on what you're doing, if you're doing a presentation, that's going to be a different opening, than if you're writing an email or if you're starting a meeting. Even starting a meeting, instead of saying, good morning, everybody, let's get started, maybe starting out with, hey, listen, today I'd like to all to think about what's the biggest thing that's changed in the last week that we want to focus on in our meeting today. And you open up with a question. And you got people right away pulling, oh, wow, yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, well, let me think about that. So in the first, 30 seconds, you got to get their attention. And since we're all busy and preoccupied, you got to get rid of the fluff, get right to the content, and then get their attention. And every good opening really, has three main parts. It should get their attention, introduce the content, and build rapport. Those three elements are so critical in any kind of communication.
Great ideas. And it's so critical. If you don't hook the audience, if you don't get them engaged right from the start, then everything else you're going to say is not going to have much, if any, impact. So now you got their attention. Now you move into the body and it's the with them, right? What's in it for me?
Right.
Explain the why and this push versus pull language that you could hopefully unpack for us a little bit.
Yeah, I've been using push versus pull for years. And what I mean by that is push language is where you're focused on delivering the message, pushing it out there, trying to make sure people hear you and they get what you want them to say. Pull communication is where you're actually getting them to go first or you're engaging them in the process. You're helping them be a part of the communication. Maybe you're asking good questions. Maybe you're giving them a chance to share first. So I don't like to just always come out with the push, even if I'm doing a keynote, Charles. And you've been around training for a long time. Training and communicating in front of groups has changed so often in the past couple of years, let alone the last decade. Where it used to be, I call it show up and throw up. You just get up there and you go, whoa, but today people want to be engaged. And that's what I call pull communication. You have to constantly find ways to actively engage the group. And we'll get to that in the eighth step a little bit later.
And the pull language is so important. I use it a lot more than the push language. You are absolutely correct. There's so much content out there. Everyone's trying to push their wares, become an influencer, tell you how it's done. That's not the rate limiting step any longer. It's how can you curate the learning to give them it in bite-sized chunks that they're going to use and apply right away. So getting them engaged from the start is critical. Maybe you can give us some insight around what are some effective ways in which they can have a stronger call to action with a written communication, maybe an email, and also if they're speaking to someone over the phone or face to face.
Well, I really think you should start with the end in mind, right? And the old book by Stephen Covey, right? 7 Habits, that's one of the habits. So even when your opening should be tied to your closing. You should be at the beginning getting people to think about the outcome. And then, of course, at the end, you're revisiting it and then you're getting people to take some approach. So obviously, just like your opening, I mean, your closing should, build some kind of rapport, leave them feeling pretty good, but it should have something to do with how you'd like them to think, do, or feel as a result of this interaction. So I always ask my clients, is it a thinking you want them to do? Is there some kind of action you want them to take? Or is there some kind of feeling you like them to have? Now, sometimes it could be all three, but when you're working on your closing, always go to those three components and figure out what is it you're really trying to accomplish.
I have found that if you can get them to tie it to their emotions, it has so much of a stronger effect for them. If you can connect it emotionally, do that, the thoughts, the actions usually then will follow.
Yes. And again, you talked about a summary. And when you go to communicating, let's just go, for example, to written communication. You want to do the summary. But in verbal communication, I like the opposite. I like to get them to summarize because if I get them to do the summary, Charles, I'm going to find out did they get it or not. Because if they summarize and they don't have all the parts, I'm like, what? They didn't get it. I got to go back. So don't just assume a summary is always something you do.
That's great. Great insight. Getting a little bit more into that written and email communication that you've given some great tips on. Review it, read it out loud, and fix it, and even reread it because you're not getting the feedback that you would normally get if you were talking to someone.
Yeah. Written communication is linear. It's one way. There's nobody there to give you feedback and they put the meaning to the message. And so if you say, and this happened to me one time, I had sent a note to a client. I said, "Hey, nice job on your presentation." And they wrote back, "What do you mean, nice job? I worked really hard on that." I'm like, okay, super duper extra, I didn't have the right language, but again, the meaning of the message comes from the receiver. So when you're writing something, make sure you're being very clear and make sure you're thinking about, could this be misinterpreted?
The second great insight that you provide is meaningful subject lines. So many people don't even look at the subject line. They make something generic, and that's a huge opportunity lost, correct?
Oh, yeah. I mean, during the pandemic, I got an email that said lunch on Thursday. I'm like, we're all locked up. Who's going to lunch on Thursday? Well, somebody just forwarded an old email that they had, back in November before the pandemic, and they didn't change the subject line. So that subject line is so important. It's the first thing you read. And you know what? I get hundreds. I mean, I don't know you. I get 100 emails a day, maybe. I look at the subject line and I decide I'm not going to read it now. I'll read it later. So don't assume that subject line is not important. And please change it whenever you're responding to an email that makes it appropriate to that current topic.
Great insight there. The other thing that I see a lot is a wall of text, writing a novel. Instead, write short paragraphs with spaces in between. Large blocks of text, for me at least, when I look at that, I just usually skip over it unless it's something I know that I need to read or coming from someone that I better be reading that email from. I'm not looking at it, reading it thoroughly.
Again, old school folks who like to, be perfect with the grammar and the language, even in emails today, you still got to be concise. So what I tell people is think about an executive summary. Get all the important stuff out there right at the beginning and then give all the details later. You could even say, see below for more details. So short and sweet is really a key component. With text, obviously, that's been the new approach, right? Texting, we've all gotten good at short and sweet. So I'm not saying we shouldn't continue to use great grammar and have good structure, but I think we all need to be aware more and more people are impatient. So a lot of white space, shorter sentences, get to the point sooner, and you can always give people more details and refer to it later, and they can go read if they want. And one other quick thing, when you're communicating upward to the high level C suites, you got to be concise. You can't send the same email up to the CEO that you send to your, team below. You got to tailor that message to the person, which I think we'll cover in a few moments when we get to the piece.
You are correct. So next, we're moving to my favorite part of the model, the activate stage. How will you keep you and your receiver engaged? We embrace what we help to create. So you need to be continually asking yourself, right, questions on how am I going to create their buy-in, their engagement, or how am I going to sustain it, which I would say is even harder today than it was a few years ago.
Well, you're right. And I know we just quickly covered the P step, which is the person. But when you think about the P step, it goes into the activation step. Because if you're working with a person who's very introverted versus a person who's very extroverted, you're going to activate them differently. So again, the P step is think about the person and customize the message. But activation to me is critical. And there are two parts of the A step, Charles. One is, active engagement, and the other is active listening. And they're both critical today more than ever. So when you think about engagement, it's really critical that you make sure that you're finding ways to pull. Engagement is about pull, right? It's not about push. So questions, getting people to think, rhetorical questions, stories where you get people to really begin to feel something. If you got an analytical person, sometimes data is great because they're thinking about the numbers. So you think about the person and you think, what's the best way to engage them? I just want to remind people that we're all different, right? Don't treat people the way you want to be treated, which of course is the golden rule. I say treat people the way they want to be treated, which is the platinum rule, which is also a book by Dr. Tony Alessandra. And it's all about, adapting and flexing to others because the best way to communicate is tailoring your message to the receiver. So that's the P step. Again, that's a whole day course in itself. And by the way, the IMP part of the process is what I call the IM planning, right? It's where you start to plan the content. The ACT is where you start to plan the delivery, right? And so activation is very critical, whether you're having a conversation, even in an email, you want to be able to activate, by using good language, by using white space. That's part of activation. When you make this easier to read, it's activating the receiver.
So critical. I love how you break the two parts of the model. So that the first three parts is the planning stage. The second three parts begins now. How are you going to act it out? How are you going to implement this? And keeping people engaged, so difficult. But what people might find surprising in this stage is it really, I feel it begins with listening, because you can't activate someone you really don't know. And if you haven't been listening to what their feedback is, to what their responses are, you're not in a very good position to keep them engaged. So go through with us a little bit, Patrick, on some of the key tips, tools for active listening.
Well, again, there are two types of listening, active and passive, right? Passive listeners are the kind of people who think they're really paying attention, but they're not, right? They're thinking about themselves. They're focused on themselves. I'll give you a quick example. This happened, before COVID, but I walk into the office one day, I yell across the room, "Good morning." And they yell back, "Fine, thank you." And I'm like, "Wow, I just said good morning." They're thinking I'm asking, "How are you?" Because they're not really paying attention. So to be a good listener, you have to understand there's a gap between how fast people think and how fast people speak. The average person can think. Well, you have a guess, Charles, about how fast the average person can think?
I would say at least 5 to 6 times faster than they can speak. Is that
Yeah. You're close. It's roughly 3 to 5,
okay?
right? The average person thinks about 500 words per minute. The average person speaks at about 125. Now, I'm not average. I'm about, 325 because I talk pretty quickly. But the idea is that to be a good listener, you really have to focus because you can think 3 times faster than the person's talking. And if you don't use that gap to stay focused, you're going to miss a lot of the message. So being a good listener, you're right, Charles, is a very important part of the process. I always like to say, look, one of the best things that happened to me was learning how to be a coach because as an extrovert, you know what? I like to process out loud. I like to speak before I think. And so if you're an extrovert, you probably want to be a little better listener than you are right now because your tendency is to be wanting to be in charge or wanting to share information. So think before you speak. I want to encourage everybody who's listening today, come up with your top 5 good questions, right? What are some of the good questions you could be asking early on to get information before you start making a decision? And so I hope people will start to think about some good questions they could be asking. Do you have a favorite question, Charles, that you use? And I'm just curious. I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, I mean, it kind of depends on the situation, but I always try to. There's one other IMS educator that says, practice the rule of two, meaning
Yes.
you have to ask them 2 questions about themselves before you can say anything about yourself. And I found this to be the case so often is that everyone's favorite topic is usually themselves.
Right.
I've had some of the best feedback from colleagues saying, you just really impressed this individual with your conversation and what happened yesterday. What did you do? And I said, I just kept asking him questions about themselves, right?
Right.
Trying to have more insight, more understanding of why they did certain things or what they were interested in. I don't think they asked me anything about myself. So I'm so happy that it went so well, but that's really what you got to focus on. If you want to be an interesting person, it's really critical to know that to be that type of person, you have to be interested in the other person and what
Yes.
they want, not trying to be so fascinating and talk about yourself.
Right. And there's a lot of kind of questions, but there's 2 critical ones I'd like you to think about: open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. And when you're with an extrovert, I just suggest you might want to ask a few more closed-ended questions because sometimes extroverts could go on and on and on. So
Like I
and
just did.
sometimes,
Right.
no, it's okay. But when you're with an introvert, you got to be careful that you don't ask closed-ended questions. If you say, "How are you?" They could say, "Fine." So again, think about the kinds of questions you're asking. As I said earlier, part of your homework assignment, if you're listening today, is start to pay attention to the kind of questions you ask. You ask a lot of open-ended questions. You ask a lot of closed-ended questions. You ask a lot of long-winded questions. Some people ask a question that takes 4 minutes, right? That's not a question. That's a speech.
And also get credit for listening. So pay attention, good eye contact, nodding. And
Yes.
what I find too, a lot of leaders do is that they're almost waiting for you to stop talking so they can start talking their point of view. They haven't even been listening to you. They're just waiting for a break in the action so they can really communicate what they really want. So it's really important that if your mind's racing and to get it to stop racing, maybe you need to clarify, maybe you need to backtrack, summarize, have a more active listening role throughout their conversation or throughout their speech so that you're better positioned to communicate back the feedback more effectively or continue that conversation in a more positive manner.
Yes. And I want everybody who's listening right now to think about what's your talk listen ratio. You don't want it to be 80% me talking. The higher you go up in the organization, the more you want to be an effective leader. You've got to be 50-50 or a 60-40 or 40-60, but not 80-20. So good questions are great tools in our toolbox, and that's a very important part about being an active listener. And as we said, the A step also is about active engagement. Now, asking questions is part of engaging people, but engagement to me is so critical. You've seen the Gallup studies and the whole idea of, they're saying like less than a third of people in the workforce are saying they're engaged. And with COVID and being virtual, we got to think all the different ways we can really start to engage people. And I have three big categories I like people to think about. I want you to engage your team or your employees, your coworkers physically, mentally, and emotionally. So I call it the 3D experience. Let's just jump. I'm going to push you to the next part because I know we're going to run out of time, but I wanted to spend a few minutes on the engagement part of activation step.
Great. So, yeah, with the engagement, just some tools that I use, questions, like you mentioned, stories are effective to engage those three. Examples, not facts, figures, data, they can get lost. Some people aren't inherently interested in those. And I would argue that storytelling is really an underserved, underutilized leadership skill that all leaders could improve upon because you don't remember what people say. You remember how they made you feel. And stories have a profound way of doing that. So
Yeah, I
keep those
agree. In
keys in
fact,
mind.
yeah, well, just take stories for a second. I do a lot of presentation skills coaching, and I tell all my coaching clients, start keeping a story file. Things happen to you all the time. You hear stories from your team members, you hear stories from your frontline leaders that are powerful so that you'll have a toolbox of stories. Because people always say, well, I don't have any stories. We all have a bunch of stories. We just don't remember them. So here's another tip for our listeners today. Start a story file when things are happening to you throughout the week. Put them in your file. And then when you have to run a meeting or you're thinking about how do I make this point more relevant, you can look through your story file and pull out a tip or story. And Charles, the secret today used to be stories were 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Stories today have to be 90 seconds. You can do a quick story. Think about the story I just shared about walking into the office. Good morning. Fine. Thank you. That was a 30-second story, but that was a way to illustrate the point how people are sometimes a passive listener. So I agree with you about stories.
Let's move to the next step. So the next step of the model is to clarify, is the message you sent to me the same that the message or same as the message that I received? And you really caution people to beware of the selective perception process, right? That
Yes.
really the receiver, based on their personal history, screens 70 to 90% of the communication they receive.
Yeah, that's very high. That seems kind of high, doesn't it? But really, people always think that they put the meaning to the message. But I really want to share with you, I think many times the receiver puts the meaning to the message, and we have to check for understanding. We have to make sure that the meaning we send is the one they're getting. So, A, leave time for questions, right? So many times people don't leave time for questions, and people have questions that they don't answer. They don't get them answered. Also, when you think about checking for understanding, be aware that the message is not just being received by what you say, but also by how you say it. And so people pick up on subtle cues. And so, you were talking earlier about making good eye contact. When the beginning of COVID hit, we had people looking, having the camera up their nose or not looking at the camera. And, that was really kind of saying, hey, that's giving me a message. So checking for understanding is a C step. And it's not just done at the end of the meeting or at the end of the conversation. You do it throughout. And even though these steps are listed in this certain order, because I want to make an acronym that was memorable, you don't necessarily have to do them in this order. You don't have to wait, to do a C step. You do the C step early on. Even in the intention, you might want to check for understanding.
Right. It's an iterative process throughout. So note that. And there's that C step, that clarification really speaks back to that active listening, right, as well, so that you can rephrase, paraphrase, and get
Right.
clarification on things that they state that you may not have understood. And you can explore things, go deeper with close-ended or open-ended questions so that you get more understanding of what those issues are. So critical from my experience and from what all I've seen, the biggest missing piece of communication that really takes the next step, or the leaders that take the next step with that, are the listening skills. People think communication is all about what they say, how they say it. It definitely is, but a large part of it is about the listening skills. And I think all leaders could use some understanding around that and get better at that piece of it.
And just for a minute, think about how if you actively engage people, you help them retain the message. So the engagement step really is a critical part of also the clarification, because if you're droning on, people are tuning out and they're not
Right.
listening. So all these pieces come together. It's not just any one piece in and of itself. So the C step is check for understanding. Make sure you leave time for questions. Make sure you clarify. And when we think about it, that's the nice thing about using multiple methods, because if we're doing a presentation and we have a slide, that's another way to make sure the message is clear and understood. So your visuals, for example, can reinforce the message that reduce any misinterpretation.
And the final step really brings it all together. Transform. How will you transform this communication into action that leads to results? That is so critical in so many areas of the business, and it's so difficult. What are some of the tips that you would give listeners in helping them with this step?
Well, first of all, this is a circular approach. So you're coming back to your intention. So the cleaner, the clearer, the more powerful the intention, the more likely the transformation. So if you're not really clear about what you want to have happen at the beginning, when you get to the transformation step, it's not going to really happen. And Charles, sometimes, this is a planning process. So you're thinking about communicating, walking through the steps. And what I found, even myself, is when I get to the transformation step and I think, I don't think it's going to happen. I go, I better go back around and double check. So then I go back around again and I go back and I'll say, my intention wasn't clean. That's why the transformation isn't happening. So what do you want people to think, do, or feel? Right. And then at the end, you want to make sure that you have that call for action. If the whole point of our conversation was for people to feel better, which I think a lot of things are happening in the environment where people need to feel better, then your transformation step's going to be about closing with something that helps people feel good about who they are or what we've done. If it's about an action, then you're going to have a time frame or some deadlines or some commitments. So again, going back to the intention, that drives the transformation.
That is critical. It's a circular process. You're going around multiple times, refining it, getting better with it. So, such a great model to use. It's a nice structured approach that I would argue leaders at every level could benefit from. Thank you for sharing that today with me, Patrick. Before we end, though, just want to talk about one particular piece of communication that's always difficult for leaders, and that's dealing with difficult issues. Are there one or two tips that you could give our listeners to help them as they're trying to either deal with a difficult issue and communicate it effectively, or possibly deal with a difficult person? And they might be two different strategies.
Yeah. Well, I first of all like to always remind everybody, we've heard it so many times. Don't take it personally. So many times people are going through a lot of things and we tend to take it personally. And when we do, that shifts everything that's going on. So always remind yourself, focus on the issue, the behavior, or the person, right? Not to take it personally. And if you start with that mindset, which is part of the transformation step, is being in the right mindset, then you're going to be able to handle a difficult situation or a difficult person even more effectively. Number two that I think is helpful is make sure you get to listen to their side of the story. Sometimes I've seen this happen, and I'm curious if you have, Charles. Somebody's very upset, and I just let them go. And they go, oh, and then they're done. And they go, oh, okay. And it's like it resolved itself because no one given the time for them to share or to be heard. So make sure you don't take it personally. Make sure you don't spend too much time doing talking at the beginning. Try to get the rest of the story. And then, of course, always remind yourself that we're all going through difficult things. And most people, again, not always, but most people are not intentionally trying to be harmful. There's something deeper that's in the way that we have to try to get to and figure out what's really going on.
Assume positive intent is so important. And for me, my thought is the majority of people, the majority of leaders don't like dealing with difficult people or having difficult issues. It's not something some people are just naturally good at. but
Right.
everyone can get better at it with practice and using some of these techniques, correct?
Yes. And, you want to think about personality styles again, because there are certain personality styles that are difficult that just as part of their personality. And then there are difficult situations that have nothing to do with personality. So it's kind of complex, but always, as I say, diagnose before you prescribe, right? Don't just jump in. Take some time to think about what's going on, what's happening, what's their side of the story, and then try to stay calm if you can. And if you need to, as always, I say, listen, maybe we need to take a quick break. Let's kind of take a break here and come back. Because when things are hot and heated, they don't get any better if you keep going.
You're right. Time to think, time to let angers cool down is an important step that many people tend to forget.
Yeah.
Well, as we near the end of this episode, I always like to ask one final question to my guests. What is one or two things that all listeners could do right away that would make them a more effective communicator? We've covered a lot, but if you
Yes.
could narrow it down to one or two things that they could start doing today.
Well, I would say the first thing is think before you speak, think before you write. Take the 30, 60 seconds and start to ask yourself, what's my intention for this communication? And it doesn't take a lot of time, but if you were to just take that extra few moments and instead of responding, think, you're going to see a huge impact on how that communication is going to go. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, I guess if I had to, I would say practice the platinum rule, right? Don't just assume, that people are like you. So treat people the way they want to be treated. And sometimes that takes, again, that conscious pause to stop and be aware of what's going on because we have what I call that stimulus response, right? And what I like to say is in between the stimulus and the response is that choice. And the choice is the part that makes the difference.
Wonderful advice. Thank you, Patrick, for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Well, they can always reach me at patrickdonadio.com, www.patrickdonadio.com. Or again, go to LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you there. I've got some great resources on my website. If you want to read some other articles, there's actually an article on dealing with difficult people right there on the resources page. But feel free to reach out. I'd love to be of service to you. And I hope you got some value today on our time together.
Thank you again, Patrick, for being a part of today's episode.
You're welcome, Charles.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into this topic and all the tips and tools that were shared. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. As always, you can head over to my LinkedIn page where you can see all the latest articles and posts from me. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. I look forward to serving you in the next episode, so hit subscribe and I'll see you then. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.